Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Preacher Voice podcast. Today, I am really excited for the conversation you're about to hear because I am sitting down for the third time with Hilary McBride. Hilary is a registered psychologist, an award-winning researcher, and the former host of Other People's Problems and the Holy Hurt podcast. She's the author of several incredible books like Mothers, Daughters, and Body Image, The Wisdom of Your Body, Practices for Embodied Living, and her latest book, Holy Hurt. We had a really good conversation about this latest work, but really we scratched the surface. If you haven't yet done so, be sure to pre-order a copy of this book so you can dive deep with Hilary McBride in this topic. And the good news is if you pre-order before April 16th, 2025, you're going to be getting 6 free recovery resources, which include 2 meditations you can use to help you feel grounded and held, a reading group guide because so much healing happens in community, and this guide will help you host a book club, lead a class, or work with clients as they read the book. You'll get an embodiment practices guide to help you connect with your body, and you're going to get coloring pages you can print out and use to soothe after reading. Plus, you'll get a 40% discount on previous books like The Wisdom of Your Body and The Practices of Embodied Living for additional healing. Visit HilaryLMcBride.com or just click the link in the show notes of this episode to pre-order your copy right now. As I mentioned, we had a great conversation about this particular book and honestly dove really deep into some of my own personal experiences through the course of the conversation, and it was just really meaningful to me. And I really appreciate the safe spaces that Dr. Hilary McBride just instantly creates to talk about really heavy topics. And with that in mind, before we start the episode, I also wanted to share an additional content warning. We do talk about the topic of child loss, so I didn't want you to go into that conversation unprepared. It's something that's very deeply personal to me, and I know it is a very heavy topic for others who might be listening. So just listen with care, and if it's not something you want to hear in today's episode, be sure to skip and catch a different episode or come back to it when you're ready. But for now, let's go ahead and get into my conversation with Dr. Hilary McBride. Remember, be sure to grab a copy of her book, Holy Hurt, which comes out very soon, and any of her other books. She's just a fantastic author, and this book stack should be on everybody's shelf if you care about these topics. But that's enough for me. Let's go ahead and get started with today's conversation. All right, everybody, welcome back to the show. Hilary, welcome back 3 times, I think now. This is number 3.
Lucky me. Maybe this will be our best one yet. We were just warming up, and now we're getting to the good stuff.
Hopefully, yeah. No, I was thinking before this, I was like, we need to do like SNL where like when the host is on 3 times, they get a jacket. I need some kind of like official club or something for this. But
yes, that's right. Okay, I'm here for the merch.
No promises yet, but if you get like a weird dinner jacket, that's the idea. No, I'm really excited to talk to you. And I think, honestly, I know every time we talk, I pump your tires for the first several minutes saying how great your work is. And it is true with the plethora of materials on religious trauma, spiritual abuse, church hurt, all these needed works that are coming out. I think it says something that every time I read one of your books, there's a big aha moment where I realize something I've never thought about. And before I get into my personal aha moment, what prompted this book at this time?
Ooh, well, timing with books is always really funny because you write them years before they're out.
Right.
So the timing is like maybe a little bit off, but I think there was a couple of things. The first one was I was seeing spiritual trauma and the impact of it in my patients, and without so many resources to direct people to, which I thought helped them understand, help them make sense of what was happening for them and how to heal in the way that I was like, oh, I want some more places that people can go. But then actually the other thing that really lit the fire under me was I listened to the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast, and I had patients of mine who were part of that community. I, in various ways, was connected to them peripherally. And I remember listening to that podcast and thinking, this is spiritual trauma, and I think people are going to be re-experiencing it as they're listening, but don't have the language to make sense of why they're going to be listening to that podcast and feel like they're panicking after. And so it was thinking, okay, if we're going to be telling true stories about what's wrong, we also need to be given a framework through which to understand why that impacts us, not just here are the facts.
Yeah.
Here's what happened, and here's why it's wrong. But also, okay, and here's why it's still stuck in us, even though we left the church, or even though we're just reading a newspaper article about it, or just listening to a podcast about it. So that for me felt like the impetus to really get started, because I just wanted people to understand why they could listen to a story and feel so scared.
Like, I was listening to an interview that you did, and one of the things you said early on in the conversation was that you didn't realize, how close this was to you, how connected you were to this
Mhm.
topic until you started writing it. Was there any reticence once you started getting that feeling to go like, let's stop picking at this, that is starting to feel really close to home, and maybe write about something that is a little bit more distant and, leave those wounds untouched? Did you have any of that feeling going through the writing process?
You'd laugh if you saw the emails between the producer of the Holy Herd podcast and I, because that's really where it started. Is I had a platform through Sanctuary Mental Health, and they said, "Hey, what do you want to talk about?" It, and I said, "Oh, I have a lot to say about spiritual trauma. Could we produce something that was a free resource for people that
Mhm.
might help them understand what's happening for them?" And as I got into it, we had this deadline, and I'm 6 or 7 or 8 months past the deadline, and I've not started, and that's actually not how I operate in my work. Like,
Yeah.
I survived graduate school and many degrees by being really, really, really good at getting things in on time and managing my tasks. So I knew, looking at that deadline creeping far into the distance, that this was not about time management. This was about
Yeah.
something inside of me that I didn't know how to touch. And for me, it was like I couldn't even write about it from a distance. I couldn't circumnavigate the things that were staring me in the face. And so what that ended up meaning was my work in my own personal therapy took a departure from some of the content that we typically work on to engage with this material more deeply. And it was actually on the other side of feeling like, okay, I have moved some of the energy around this, the rage, the terror, the grief, the shame.
Mhm.
And now I can write. And I can write because on the other side of getting access to all of that pain, I got access to my creativity. On the other side of access to all of those memories that felt stuck, I felt connected to the truth of who I am. And I know that that's true of so many of us, that when we are stuck in certain ways, that we avoid the places that are tricky to be with,
Yeah.
but in doing so we lose access to the place where all of the deep inner knowing and the creativity and the sense of purpose and passion is as well.
It's something you talk about later in your book, where you talk about like you're addressing specifically why we return to these toxic environments or these ways of thinking. And you basically say like, it's the path that has been trodden so much that it's a well carved out path. It's clear what's going to happen. And
Mhm.
then you look at the side that's completely unnavigated, uncharted, and it's a lot harder to choose that path. And it sounds like
Yes.
that's kind of similar to the journey of exploring these topics as well. As like, there's a
Yes.
way I feel comfortable talking about this, but maybe this
Yeah.
new way or this new angle or perspective, I'm not quite ready to take that plunge.
Yeah, that's such a great way of describing it, that it's not just the way that we operate kind of unconsciously in our life, but also how we relate to material from our past. That is also something that we're like, it's really easy to fall into the grooves of what is it? Everything was fine.
Yeah. Right.
Or like, there's nothing to see here. And it is a lot more complicated and tricky and painful and uncertain for us to say, well, what happens if I turn that rock over? What will I find there?
I'm going to push deeper on that, and I was going to save this question for
Mhm.
later, but we're already here, so let's take
We're
this
here.
this path.
Wait, wait,
Um,
wait. Aren't you going to tell me about your aha moment?
okay, that was next in the outline, so I'll share it here,
Okay.
and then I'll circle
Okay.
back to this. But
Okay.
one of the things that my aha moment in this, which, and I've got your other books here, but Wisdom of Your Body, like you are your body, was like a big aha moment for me. Never had thought about that in context of religion. The inhibiting emotions in this book was a huge aha for me. So I'll give you two.
Mm.
But the third
Ooh.
was in Holy Hurt, which is on page 26 in the advanced reader copy. I don't know for people listening where it ended up. Um, but you ended up talking about spiritual trauma. And I've heard about spiritual trauma, and I've heard some of these things described but not in a way that's like clicked for me. And I've probably even have
Oh,
said some of these things, but not in a way that clicked. But
right.
we hear spiritual trauma in terms of things that happen to us in the church. Like a youth pastor did this at this church, or I had this experience calling something out in my church. I talk about that all the time. I've been talking about that for like 5 years. In the book, you talk about experiences that happen to us that we view through a spiritual lens and the way that brings
Mm.
spiritual trauma. And that was like, I was literally flipping through this page, like both pages are just underlined all over the place.
Ah, wow.
And it was really powerful to me because, from my own personal experience, and I'm sharing this with permission and want to be sensitive to it. But one of the things that has caused a lot of trauma for me is when we first got married, my wife and I, we went to India to work at an orphanage. And during that time, I was really navigating my religious beliefs. And so I was reading a ton about, eschatology, like going down all these rabbit holes. And I happened to be heavily reading about demonology during the time that we were there, which painted my experience as a very staunch fundamentalist Christian, being in a country where Christianity is not the dominant religion. It painted a very unhealthy view of the culture, of things I was around. I felt like I perceived a spiritual warfare that was very intense in my mind.
Mm.
And we got pregnant while on the mission field, and ended up having a miscarriage on the mission field. And
Mm.
one of the last days before that happened, I had visited a temple in the country, and
Oh, I
and
see.
I had been reading heavily about this, and I was convinced, and it sounds silly to Eric in 2025,
Mm-hmm.
but I was
Mm-hmm.
convinced I was not prayed up enough. I had brought something back. I had brought some kind of
Yeah.
oppression. And, in many ways, it caused a deeper trauma than an already traumatic event, which is I'm
Mm-hmm.
trying to support my wife who's going through this physical pain in another country, limited medical help, all these different layers. And I identified that as a traumatic experience, but reading the book, I was like, that is exactly what that is. It's something that happens outside of a spiritual context. It's a perfectly
Mm-hmm.
normal medical situation that because of the
Mm-hmm.
teaching I was absorbing, I applied a
Right.
spiritual lens onto. And it was just, I read it and I literally went in and I said, this is what I've been trying to explain for like the last like five, like however long it's been,
Wow.
7 years.
Wow.
And I think
Huh.
back, there's so many situations like that where perfectly normal
Yeah.
events, things happen, things happen that are hard, things
Mm.
happen that are great, but we can apply this aesthetic or this veneer over it of it happened
Mm-hmm.
because I did this, or it happened because God wanted this. And yeah,
Right.
that was a big aha moment reading it. And
Um,
I'll probably insert some more of that in the actual episode, but that that specific page was like, wow, like this is really interesting.
Thank
Um,
you so much for sharing that story with me. I'm so sorry that happened. And I'm also so glad you finally have language to understand why it felt like just as bad as it did. Because I'm hearing what you likely experienced was also so much blame of yourself, like you had done something wrong to cause it.
right.
So when we think about those spiritual lenses that we apply to everyday events, it's not just a spiritual lens that's neutral. There's an element of causality to it. There's a
Yeah.
valence in some sense that I'm responsible or God is responsible. And so not only is this thing happening that's awful, but there's an actor
Hmm.
who is making it happen, an agent who's
Yeah.
making it happen, who could have done otherwise. And therefore there's some meaning to be mined here about
Yeah.
what's bad, if I'm bad, if this was on purpose, if I need to experience this suffering, if I didn't do something good enough and that's why it's hurting as bad as it is. Like there's just so many more layers where the awful in life can be compounded into these incredibly vicious
Yeah.
self-referential cycles of punishing ourselves and blaming ourselves. So, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry that that was part of your
Yeah.
reality. And like I said, so glad that you have like the things are clicking into place
Sure.
to make sense of why it hurt that much.
Yeah. And it's
Yeah.
stuff that's again, it's unfortunate. And I look back at that time and go, because of the messaging I was taking in, which was very, I think careless on the part of some of the people I was consuming and the messaging that they were giving out, but it shaded how I viewed everything and made me less effective at actually handling the situation, which is,
Right.
you're looking at people's normal cultural activities with a sinister lens. You're looking
Mhm.
at which to be very clear, saying this now, I don't have that same view. Um, you know, Trying to support my spouse while also having this
Mm.
internal, like, in my mind, there's moments about this that are about me and my decisions, and
Mhm.
when I should have been solely focused on her experience. There's lots of different layers of that pulled me out of the moment. And you talk so much about embodiment. It pulled me away from the reality of the situation and put me into this eternal good versus evil battle that really
Mhm.
wasn't involved in this situation at all. And again, I know for people listening and people who read the book, like, I think the more people think about it, the more they're going to have those situations pop up where they go, this didn't even happen. This happened at my house. This happened at college. But the way I was raised or the way that I absorbed my theology painted it a completely different light, that
Right.
added harm. Um, this kind of leads me
Mm.
to the path that I was mentioning before, which is,
Mhm.
you know, I sit there and there's times I have conversations and I have these aha moments where I notice something really bad that really affected in a negative way. And
Yeah.
sometimes it's easy to go, I wish I'd never noticed that. I felt like I moved
Oh.
past it, but there's this big gaping wound that's right underneath the surface, or the
Mhm.
shard of glass, like you talk about in your book, under the
Right.
skin that, oh, I didn't realize that was still there. For people who are listening who are going, you know, why do I want to dig deeper? I feel like I've addressed the traumas I need to address. I don't want to keep digging and finding new ways that I've been harmed in the past. Like, that's kind of
Right.
the approach they're coming in to a book like this with. What would you say to that? Like, what is the value of trying to further understand things that may have added harm? Like, for someone who's been out of the church 10 years and goes, I don't really think about it as much, but if I do dig, it starts hurting. Like,
Mm.
what would you
Right.
say to those people? Like, how should they examine whether the journey's right for them?
Well, I think, and this would be in a way referencing my past work that ideally some listeners know about. If you're not familiar, one of my areas of expertise as a psychologist is embodiment and
Mhm.
understanding trauma and the body. My understanding is that if it hurts, that's actually a valuable message. And that the reason why we move away from the hurt is not because the hurt itself is unsurvivable. It's usually because it's intolerable. And why is it intolerable? Usually because we haven't actually had the relational skill and support to teach us that staying with that pain takes us somewhere very, very, very good and important.
Mhm.
And what I'm not talking about here is a kind of like self-abusive approach to therapy or self-examination where we're just picking and picking and picking,
Yeah.
right? I'm sure people who have had those experiences with a hangnail or something, you just pick, 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 and then all of a sudden it's open and bleeding. That's not what we're talking about. But if you're noticing that somewhere internally feels tender as you reflect on it, as you
Yeah.
remember it, or there is a place inside of you where you say, I'd rather not go there, what you're likely meeting is some kind of information that your body is giving you about a pathway that needs to be walked in order to for you to have access to more of yourself. Because I think that that's what the wisdom of our body is these places that we have been taught culturally in the church and culture at large. Don't look at these. Don't stay with your body. Don't listen to what you're feeling. If it hurts, if it's scary, move away from it, right? Move away from your illness, move away from your dissociation, move away
Mhm.
from your panic and your fear. And yet the way that the nervous system works, the way that the body is organized is such that that information is getting served up because our body is saying, hey, we can't quite be at homeostasis
Mhm.
until you're on the other side of this. And I liken those tender spots sometimes to be like like a parking ticket reminder notice. If you've ever gotten one of those in the mail where you open up the letter and you're like, oh, that's right. I forgot to pay that. And it's this huge, bright yellow piece of paper. At least that's what they are in the municipality that I'm in. It's like impossible to ignore, except if you fold it up and put it in the white envelope. But right, there's some tell even just looking at the envelope, oh, there's something in here that I've got to deal with. The point is that our body is constantly giving us these reminder notices. hey, there is some unfinished business for you here. And
Right.
again, what we haven't been shown, if we've been taught how to stay with the pain to make sense of it through the other side, is that there is more creativity, there's more connection to self, there's more sureness of our goodness, there's more capacity for desire, for ease, for
Mm,
compassion, for connection. It's like the pain, as long as is staying in us in an unprocessed way, is actually taking energy away from the core self inside of us that knows how to be creative, courageous, compassionate, clear, connected, right? All of those things that if you're familiar with the 8 C's in therapy that we talk about it being as being at the very root of who we are. So I would say, I think there's more goodness for you on the other side. And maybe if I adjust my language briefly there, I'll say it's not that you will be more good
mm.
because nothing could make you more good. It's that you have more contact with the truth of your goodness. And who wouldn't want that?
What's the connection, I guess, to closure? Like a closure is a word that gets said a lot. And I certainly have areas in my life where I feel I have a closure. The experience I just mentioned,
Mhm.
I feel like I have a closure, from having plenty of conversations and communication with my spouse and like all these things that have helped close that wound in a way where, there's moments that it can be raw if you really sit and put yourself back in that
Mhm.
time. But in the present, there's a sense of, that happened, it's part of it. And now we exist, like with that not being a constant pain.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
but I think this really comes up to me a lot as like a creator. I'm somebody who is creating things related to a lot of trauma. And it inspires some of the creativity you mentioned. It inspires some of the messaging you put out, and whether that's painting or podcasting or making movies or writing books or whatever that looks like for people, you're drawing from that well in some way. Do you think there's ever a moment of like definitive like closure, or should there be like where should
Mhm.
the goalpost be, I guess, in the healing journey where people are going like, but when will I be done with this? Like when do I get my completion award? It says I dealt with
Yes.
religious
Yes.
trauma. Like how should people reframe that in their mind?
Yeah. I want to take like a feminine and feminist orientation to time here, because I think when we use an androcentric or male centric perspective of time, there's a linearity to it where we
Mm,
assume that healing happens on a linear continua or a linear pathway, and that there should be a point of closure, which
sure.
signifies it's done. And yet, when we think about a feminine perception of time, we think about things like the cycles and the seasons.
Mm,
Right? If I plant something in my garden in the fall and it comes up in the spring, and then I have to plant again in the fall because it's, those bulbs, they've done their work. It's time for new bulbs again. I don't think we would look at that and say, oh, I failed. The bulbs didn't live on forever. We would say, no, this is what happens as we come back around and we move through the cycle again of time and seasons, and we grow kind of like tree rings, right? Where we're accumulating more and more
mm,
wisdom and more insight, and we're accessing different developmental stages of our life. It would make sense that there would be some things that we would have even more insights on, or we'd feel differently about, or that would open up for us. And a really, really good example of that is people who process their religious trauma and then they have children. And then they say, holy moly, my kid is way more free, has way less sexual
mm,
shame, is so connected to themselves. I've given them everything I wished I had. And now I feel even more grief about what I didn't have because I can see a version of my life that I'm just never going to be able to live. And it's playing out in front of me in the life of my child. So instead of assuming that there is a done and that that's actually something we should aspire to, what I want to suggest is that as we move through different developmental stages of our life, even old age, we're going to look back and we're going to think, oh my gosh, why was I so hard on myself? Or, ooh, I see it clearly now. Those leaders should have never, like now that I'm of the
yeah.
age of the person who hurt me. And so I want us to just have so much more compassion for the process of living that has us moving in spirals and cycles of continual expansion and self-knowing, as
Mm.
opposed to a fixed point on a time scale that we should achieve. And I'll also say that I think that there are some things that we can point at that do highlight, okay, what is different about it now that there is some degree of processing that's completed. So I looked at trauma theory about this, and one of the trauma theories is, do I not feel pulled back into that situation
Mm.
in such a way that my body is responding appropriately for back then, but is kind of like my reaction's not really making sense for the present moment here and now? Like, am I re experiencing something as I remember? And I would say that processing to me, on some level, has reached a certain point of completion for now. If people can remember and revisit the material and the experiences inside of them, and feel appropriately moved about it. My goal as a trauma therapist is never that someone looks back on the worst moment of their life and feels nothing. Like, that's actually not healthy either. We actually want to feel
Right.
sad about sad things. But there can be like a time orientation that changes as people process material to feel like, oh, that's over. That thing that happened is over. The impact of it is still remaining, and I can grieve the impact of it. But I actually know that I got out and that I'm safe, and I've built a life of meaning on the other side of that. And one of the hallmarks of a kind of closure of sorts is actually the ability to mourn the self. That comes from the ADP clinical literature, that when we get enough to the other side of a trauma, we can actually feel grief about the fact
Mm.
that it happened. And so it's a funny thing to grieve and feel like, wait, why does it hurt more? But the grieving is actually the body's natural response to the sense of conclusion
Hmm.
to that time.
Well, it's interesting because like I've always looked at it as like a ladder, or like climbing a mountain, where it's like, yeah, I went through my angry stage, I went through my sad stage, and now I'm getting into this say, and then I'm grateful for some of these things. I learned these lessons, and I love the approach of it being cyclical, where it's like I'm continually kind of because it's part of you, like it's something that happened to you, so you're not leaving it in the past.
Mhm.
Um, but it's something every time you cycle back around it, you have a new perspective and new
That's right.
layers of perspective on it. Where, like you said, you know, when you immediately leave, there might just be pure anger that helps protect you and gets you out of a situation,
Yeah.
but then
Yeah.
you might have grief because you miss the nostalgia of candlelight services at your church or whatever that looks like. And then you move
Mhm.
forward and maybe you're angry at a different level where it's like, oh, I didn't realize until I had kids, like you mentioned, that I was as bad as it was. And it's I think it's really cool to have the permission to feel those emotions at every stage. But
Mhm.
I guess the difference is like, are those emotions like, are you in some way experiencing those emotions in a healthy way? Like, are they coming from a
Mhm.
place that's true and real and honest? And like, how do you process those at that time? I think that's a really neat way to look at it. It's
Mhm.
I don't know if you have anything else to say on that, but I definitely want to mention what you said about you alluded to having children, and the way that affects this experience. But did you have any more thoughts in terms of like the cyclical nature of viewing past experience?
You know, it reminds me a little bit of the Richard Rohr idea. I believe it's Richard Rohr. I hope I'm not misattributing it to him, but the transcend and include phenomena, the idea that we don't actually ever reject any parts of ourselves
Mm.
or send them away, but that we find a way to expand beyond the limitation of those experiences and include them on some level. And this fits really beautifully with Judith Herman's triphasic model of trauma treatment, that until we're safe, we can't actually begin to reprocess.
Mm.
But on the other side of reprocessing is integration. It's actually saying, okay, how has that shaped me? How am I making meaning of that? What does that do for me in terms of helping me see the world
Mm.
differently? And for some people, there's acts of advocacy and there's acts of activism on the other side of that. I think that parenting can be an act of activism. I think that the ability to turn towards ourselves with a different posture than we were raised to can be activism. Right. I think
Yeah.
that the personal is always political in that sense. So there's for me a real sense of can I include that part of my life in my narrative of myself and understand how it has shaped me instead of rejecting or distancing or cutting myself off from it. And that ultimately might tell us that we have the story instead of the story having us.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great way to put it. Um, I want to talk about parenting. I didn't expect to talk about it, but
Mm.
it seems
Here we are.
important to talk about. Um, this is one of the things like when we talk about this idea of the path and they're like there's the well-trodden path that's easy to choose. It's why people return to the abusive church or the toxic family or
Mhm.
whatever that environment looks like. I have heard so much from people who listen to the show, and I've wrestled with this too. Is like this unknowingness of how to raise children when you were raised a totally different way. And,
Mhm.
I know so many people who bucked against the Christian school system and then had kids and were like, well, I don't want my kid to turn out bad. So I'm going to put them in the same system,
Right, right.
or I better get in church because I want them to have a moral compass, even though their moral compass they do not attribute to the church of their youth, or
Right.
down the line with all these examples. But parenting feels very time sensitive and it feels like you have to make these decisions very quickly where they're born and it feels like in the next couple of years it's where do they go to school, do I put them in church, what do I tell them when they ask about who created all the all these layers. What advice would you give to parents who are terrified to essentially test a new method with their kids versus pursuing the same well-trodden path that's at least familiar,
Yeah.
like how do you navigate that balance? And I know you're right on the precipice of having to make all those decisions with the what 16-month-old,
Oh no,
17-month
that was in the book. She's actually
the book.
3.5 now.
Oh,
Yes.
well, even
As time
closer to the
passes, right?
precipice, about to jump off. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. A couple things come to mind. The first one is having a why. Understanding our
Mm,
why can be really important. And the second one is repair. And I'll unpack those two things. The first one, why, is we are going to make choices as parents that we see differently as our kids age, and we're going to see the impact of our choices differently as they age. That's inevitable, whether you do this thing or that thing, whether you put them in the Christian school or the mainstream school. Like there will be something that happens where you go, oh, okay, right, this choice that I made had this impact. And of
mm,
course we can never know with the crystal ball but what would have happened if we did it differently. But if we can connect with our why, then I think it allows us to tolerate the distress of the choice that we make. So
yeah.
if we're going into, trying to recreate on some level the educational experience that our parents gave us because we feel scared of what it would be like to put them in a mainstream public school, at least being honest about that. Why I feel scared, right? As long as we can tell the truth to ourselves about that, then we actually get closer to understanding what's happening in our motivation.
Mm,
And we might have more insight or ideas emerge about, okay, well, maybe that's actually not the thing that I want to have motivate me in my parenting
right.
choices. Maybe I want to parent from a place of confidence and trust and open heartedness, not fear. So if I can be honest about what is my why, then it might help me reorient towards some of the things that, might feel like more congruent choices for me,
Mm,
or they might help us go, okay, this is what I need to do to help me manage my fear. So here I am, I'm doing it. I'm telling the truth about it to myself and maybe to other people. And at least then when my child comes back to me and says, why did you do that? I can say, I felt really scared and I can tell
yeah.
the truth, right? I felt really scared and I didn't know how to do it differently, which can you imagine what it would be like if our parents said that instead of, well, I needed to protect you and the secular schools were going to damage you, to say like, I didn't know how to do it differently and I felt scared and I
Yeah.
wanted to protect you and I didn't know how. Like, so there's something beautiful in just acknowledging the why, even if the why highlights like, ooh, this is, I feel trapped or I feel scared or I feel ashamed or I don't know there's another way. And then repair. Repair is one of the most underutilized parenting resources that I think that exists in the psychological literature. There are three things that we know create secure attachment, which is the hallmark of mental health. It's the hallmark of emotion regulation. It's the bottom, like it's the ground underneath a secure sense of self for a
Mm,
child who grows into an adult. So we know that attachment is key. What are the things that go into attachment? There is, of course, attuned experiences where parents are meeting the needs of their kids, anticipating their needs at times, acknowledging their emotional experiences, considering their inner world, being available to meet not just their physical needs, but emotional needs. So those things are pretty fairly obvious. I talk about those in the book if you're interested in that. The second thing is that there's rupture. Those are those moments of conflict, of break, of missing each other. But the magic is that within the math equation for what makes secure attachment is the third thing, repair. It means that we've actually built into our psychological literature an understanding of how we will miss each other and how to come back to each other.
Hmm.
It's kind of like how tissue heals after an injury. And what we know is that when tissue heals after an injury at the level of the body, that tissue is stronger, it's denser, right? It's more robust in a way to protect against future injury at that site. So similarly, in the relationships we have caregiver to child, when there is a rupture, when there is something that is, doesn't go well, whether we know about it now or later, the ability to repair is actually the secret magic ingredient to making the whole thing work. Not being perfect, not getting it right every time, but actually the courage and think the absolute like wisdom to know how to say to your kids, you're so right. I hurt you. Tell me what that was like for you. I want to know.
Yeah.
And, this brings me back to a moment I had with my mom. My mom and I, if you read my first book, Mothers, Daughters, and Body Image, I talked at length about the complicated relationship I had with my mom and its role in the development and healing of my own eating disorder. And I remember this moment. It was on Mother's Day. I will never forget that because God bless my mom for talking about all of this on a day when I think many mothers would have said, like, it's about me. It's about me. We sat down, we were having this conversation, and she said, what was it like for this experience for you? It was something, that happened regularly in my childhood growing up. She said, what was that like for you? And I said, I don't know if I want to get into that today, mom. Like, I don't know. Like this day, like let's talk about that another day. It's Mother's Day today. Like we're just about to go out for dinner. And she looked me in the eye and she said, I want to know. I actually want to know what that was like for you. Not the version of the story that you want to tell me because it's easy for me, but the real story of what it was like. And so I told her about what had hurt and how hard it was for me. And after she said this, like for the rest of my life, I think on my deathbed, I'll remember this moment. After she said, I'm so sorry. I didn't know that was what it was like for you. She said to me these words, I want to know how else I've hurt you.
Hmm.
I want to know. It was like she was opening up space to say, I am ready to acknowledge the injuries between us. I am ready to look at how I hurt you. And I'm not going to shy away and I'm not going to blame you and I'm not going to defend myself. I just want to know about the things that have caused a fragmentation in the bond that we have.
Hmm.
And I'm ready to know. And her invitation of that for me said, oh, I can actually do closeness with you now in a way that I couldn't before. And so I tell that story because I think I want parents to know that it is scary at times for us to say to our kids, I'm sorry, I hurt you. But
Hmm.
the truth is that our children experience that as an invitation for us to be even more connected. And when they can be even more connected with us, think about all the other things we can repair and walk alongside
Yeah.
them with and the closeness we can have. And so if we could do repair, I think that comes back to that first point. Like, okay, we might make the wrong choice. I think all of us will make choices that in 20 years from now, whether it's in parenting or work or marriage or dating or like whatever it is, we'll say, I do it differently now. That's it true of writing a book. I mean,
Yeah.
writing a book is like an extremely vulnerable thing because what you're saying is I'm putting a stamp on something that I believe at this time, full well knowing we all change our ideas about things. Like in 5 years from right now, I might look back, wow, oh my gosh, holy hurt. It was so reductive. It missed so many angles that I see now. And so the ability to go, okay, like this is the choice I made, and I'm going to take responsibility for it later when I know more is, I think it's part of how we do health.
Coming out of like very, high control religious environments, we're so like we're so pushed to have ideals for things. Like what does it look like? And you know, even when I was mentioning earlier, like the example of people saying, I don't want my kid to turn out this way. It's like you're pushing your kid to this ideal of, and really I feel like the most common thread I hear from people who grow up in those environments, and it's a habit that's hard to shake when you raise your own kids, is like this feeling of control of I need you
Mm.
to fit. I don't want you to go to this school because you'll get this idea that's different than my ideas, and that's going to be a
Mhm.
problem because it hurts my reputation or it makes me feel concerned or unsure how to deal with this. And I think just in any relationship, whether it's pastor to congregants, whether it's parent to kids, whether it's kids to parent, it's like putting aside those ideals that you have and letting the person exist, I think helps avoid the missing each other. Like I love that language
Yeah.
of like we're missing each other. Like what am I trying to
Yeah.
accomplish? What were you trying to accomplish? And I think the quote that I heard a long time ago that has stuck with me is like assume the worst possible intent of your actions, or assume the best possible intent of others' actions and assume the worst possible impact of yours. And
Mm,
I think about that all the time, where it's like
mm,
most people's motives are usually not what you assume that they are. And most times that you think you're perfectly parenting or perfectly being a spouse or perfectly being a partner or perfectly whatever that looks like, your impact is not necessarily what you think it is. And so
yeah.
I love that idea of like missing each other. Like, what are we actually trying to accomplish here? And like, let's work through it together instead of me just cramming you back into my
Mhm.
box or vice versa.
Right. Oh, and we can learn so much about spiritual development in the home by looking at psychological development through an attachment lens too, because we can think about there's a principle called the secure base, wherein a child, when they actually feel secure, they go out and explore.
Hmm.
It's because they feel secure and they know the truth of who they are and they know you have got them no matter what. They wander away from you a little bit, the playground. And they, we see this all the time in developmental context that where a parent is there. And when the kid really trusts the parent, the kid wanders away and explores and then looks back. Is mom still watching? And then plays a little bit and they do something. Hey, dad, are you looking? Look at this. Right. And then they wander back if something happens and then they wander away again. And what a beautiful metaphor for spiritual development as well, that when we know that we are deeply loved, that we are safe to explore. And it's actually because we've already at that point had such a secure foundation written into us that we can expand into new ways of thinking and new ideas. It's not a sign of failure on the part of our family or our parents. And I would say because we use language of family so often in church contexts, right? I think
Mhm.
that that can be a way to broker trust in an inappropriate, manipulative way at times, where we call someone a family or we tell someone they're part of a family, but we don't actually mean, what that word means. I think that if we're actually taking that phrase on the nose, that let's assume God is a father. That's an idea that doesn't feel personally relevant to me right now, but maybe we can say that God is a parent. We'll use that. Let's assume that God is a parent. What healthy parent wouldn't want their kid to explore in the world? What healthy parent traps their kid in their house and says, you need to look at my face for the rest of your life, or else what? You're not going to be a good kid. Like a healthy parent says, oh, yeah, let's go play in the yard. Oh, do you want to go play in someone else's yard? Okay, great. And you come home and you can sleep at my house, right? I'm going to take care of you. I'll always be here.
Yeah.
And you always have dinner on the table and you'll always be fed and cared for. But great, go
Right.
explore. And what healthy parent says, you need to come sleep at my feet for the rest of my life until you're 85 and I'm dead and gone. No, we say like, grow up, move out,
Mhm.
come home for holidays. Let's share our lives together. Call me all the time on the phone. But a healthy parent says like go expand.
Yeah.
And if we take that to be true spiritually of a heavenly parent, of an eternal parent, of a creator, it makes a lot of sense that there would be security in a healthy God to tolerate our wandering, our mistakes, our exploration. And so I
Mm.
like flipping that narrative from for people who right, have seen God as a parent figure, but that has been construed as a controlling, abusive parent, to realize like what's the healthy parent
Mhm.
do? Like, could we not apply that to our spirituality too? And what we know is that like kids, when they're in a loving, safe environment, they get to go play and explore.
Well, I know we're nearing the end of this conversation, and I'm curious. I've loved asking authors versions of this question recently, because there's always like the broad strokes of a book, right? Like Holy
Mhm.
Hurt, the title speaks for itself. Like what is the book going to be about? But beyond the title and the subtitle and some of the chapter headings, I feel like there's always these little pet ideas or the author's own aha moments that are slipped in that a reader, if they're listening at 2x on
Mm.
Audible or they are flipping through and highlighting a couple key pages, they miss these little gems that are so important to the
Mhm.
author, but maybe aren't the core concept of the book. What's one or two things that are in the book that are deeply important to you that someone who is flipping through or casually reading might miss on their first
Mm.
go through the book?
Oh, what a fun question. Thank you for that one. I think the first one is that all trauma is spiritual trauma. I think we like to reserve the term trauma, spiritual trauma, for things, as you said off the top, that happen in a religious context.
Right.
But I don't know, like, if I don't know that there's a single trauma that a person could experience that doesn't impact their spirituality. And the way that I understand spirituality is this inborn felt sense of connectedness to all things and our drive to experience meaning, to make meaning, to feel more connection
Mm,
to self, to others, and to maybe in some senses God or creator. So if that's what spirituality is, what we know happens for any traumatic event when it kind of crosses that threshold into the overwhelm that fragments us and disorganizes us, there is not a person who's had sexual abuse, physical violence growing up, a major catastrophic event where this has not altered the way that they make meaning or their sense of connectedness to themselves or others. So
mm,
I think spiritual trauma is actually, it is in some way the core feature of all trauma.
mm,
And I think if we understood that, then we'd be able to meet people in just how big the questions are inside of them on the other side of horrific events,
mm,
including things that happen outside of religious contexts. So there's that idea. I would say the second thing that really for me felt like a huge wake up call was as I started talking to Mark Charles, who, along with a co author, wrote Unsettling Truths about the history of religious trauma in Europe and its impact on colonization and essentially religious and spiritual trauma here on Turtle Island, on what we call North America, that it makes sense to me that we have these incredibly normative, traumatizing contexts in the religious sphere, because the whole reason that settlers are on North American land is because of religious trauma.
mm,
It's because Europeans decided, because of their doctrine, the doctrine of discovery, that they had every right to claim unclaimed lands, and that they, in their mind, came to North America, found unclaimed lands, which of course were fully inhabited with people who had rich religious traditions and spiritual traditions and governance structures and like beautiful ways of understanding and tending to the land, came and said, no, 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 this is like, we're going to take you and we're going to get the Indian out of you and we're going to claim this territory for God. As if God wasn't already here, as if
right.
creator wasn't already working and living. And so I think, for me, the understanding of the scale and the scope of religious trauma and spiritual trauma in North America makes a lot of sense when we look at the entire normative fragmentation and abuse upon which our Western white supremacist culture is built. Like,
Mm,
it's kind of a duh moment to go, of course, spiritual trauma is everywhere. Like, why are we even here?
yeah. It's in the
So
foundation.
from
Yeah.
it's baked into the foundation. So for me, that was actually like it helped me feel like we could move away from the individual phenomena, individual level, enough to see the systems level, which I think is an important thing for us to consider when we look at spiritual trauma, like how much there is, how rampant it is, how many people it's touching. Oh, we can see things at multiple levels, then the biological level, at the relational level, at the sociopolitical level, and again at this huge systems level of history and the legacy of colonization.
Really light answer to wrap the
Right.
show on.
Right. Yeah.
uh, no, no, that's phenomenal. I think those are two really great takeaways, and um, It's so helpful. And uh, just to add this layer of it, but the spiritual, all abuse being spiritual abuse. I mean, obviously that's the part that resonated with me the most out of everything in the book, but it's
Mm.
something that, that search for understanding the purpose of why these happen. Like I feel like my last decade of my life has been ping-ponging between the pain of feeling that this is happening because God wanted it to happen, or the pain
Yeah.
of there is no meaning to any of this, and this
Right.
kind of
Right.
very nihilistic view of it. And both are incredibly emotionally painful to grapple with. And
Hmm.
but I love resources like this that help us try to understand, and whether we're putting some meaning into things to help us process it, or whether we're actually pulling meaning from the experiences. Like, tools like this are so helpful. And so I just want to echo again, I appreciate so much you writing this book,
Mm.
in addition to all the other incredible books that you've written, and for having another conversation. I hope it's not the last, and
I
I
hope so
appreciate you
too.
joining me.
Thanks for the time, Eric, and your thoughtful questions. And for everyone who's listening, I'm so grateful that you listened. I hope the book finds its way to you at the right time and that you're gentle with yourselves as you read.